Howe, who is one of two Howe brothers who teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary. Richard has his PhD in philosophy from the University of Arkansas, and he, myself, and our executive director at our ministry, Ted Wright, once a week during the semester have a kind of a late-night group. We get together. C.S. Lewis had a group called the Inklings, where he got together with a bunch of writers and every week and just talked about issues. And Richard named our group the Thinklings. We just get together and think. We don't write much, but we have these wonderful conversations from about 10 p.m. to about 2 a.m. once a week. After class, after he teaches class, he comes over to the house and we just stay up all night talking about anything. And he is an absolutely wonderful instructor and a more wonderful person. And Richard, if you go to his website, richardghowe.com, Richard G. Howe, he's trying to get like the William Lane Craig thing going. Richard G. Howe. If you go there, H-O-W-E, and click on there, you'll see a whole number of his papers and presentations there that you can look at for free. He's also got a section on humor. And one of his famous sayings is, never criticize a man unless you've walked a mile in his shoes, because then you're a mile away from him and you have his shoes. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Richard G. Howe.
I know there are people that would just kill to be in my place to be able to hang around with Frank Turek once a week. So I brag about being able to be in his home with his lovely wife Stephanie and try to think. Maybe I can improve my thinking. Well, Albert, it took me a long time to find a picture of Albert Einstein that had the title exactly right, but I finally found the one searching Google or Bing or whatever it is that people search. What in the world is a talk about that's titled Seeing is Believing ? What in the world is that about? Many people, I think, in our culture, perhaps if not in the whole world, would say that seeing is believing, that that's the way they approach life. Certainly in the Western culture it's that way, with the proliferation of science and stuff in our culture. But when I say somebody says that seeing is believing, I'm not suggesting that for those people seeing is necessarily believing in God. I'm not saying that necessarily, even if somebody says, hey, I believe in seeing is believing. Rather, I mean that they hold that our sensory faculties, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling, are the faculties that we have to access reality and to know truth. And by the way, I don't mean to imply anything here by the use of the third person, as we will see in due course. Now, the question of how we know reality is what philosophers refer to as epistemology, which I love the word epistemology because it gives me an opportunity to spit on my students without getting in trouble for it. I'm sorry, I was just saying the word epistemology. I didn't mean to. So I warn people that come to see, this is better here with the little buffer zone. But in the workshops, people had like Visqueen, like a Gallagher concert. No, it's not that bad. Now, the problem is, it seems like, that some Christians may have with this knowing through your sensory faculties, which, by the way, philosophers refer to as empiricism, if you'll allow me to use that word on occasion. Empiricism just means, by and large, the idea that we know reality or we know truths via our sensory faculties. I think some Christians may have a problem with this as a theory of knowledge or an epistemology, because it seemingly is incapable of delivering any truth about non-sensory, or if you will, immaterial reality. So, if you say, I know reality via my sensory faculties, that seems to tacitly imply that if there's anything that's real that isn't sensory, then I can't know that. And so, some Christians may have a problem with empiricism. And I think this concern is understandable. I mean, after all, what seemingly constitutes the consummate empiricists in our culture are people like Richard Dawkins. But a quote there from Dawkins here, let's see if he'll come up. Let's all just talk awkwardly among ourselves while we're waiting for the... By the way, I have some balloons in my pocket. I have a great balloon animal that I do of empiricism. Are we okay back there? I'm going to stand here. I do this when we have sometimes we stream classes at the seminary, live internet. And so what I've been tempted to do, I've got to work it out in advance with the students so they won't make any noise when I do this. But what I've been tempted to do is while somebody's watching live over the internet, I go, so that's how we know that empiricists... and the guy at home's like, something's wrong with my computer. Can't believe this streaming. I haven't done that yet, but I'm tempted to do it. All right, here's Richard Dawkins. Now, there's two quotes here. I want you to see them one at a time because I want to point something out. If you don't mind, I'm going to awkwardly and embarrassingly and rudely turn my back to you because I don't have the quote in front of me. I just have it up here. Unlike some of his theological colleagues, Bishop Montefiore is not afraid to state that the question of whether God exists is a definite question of fact. In other words, what Dawkins is saying that he's sort of celebrating is, hey, apparently there's a lot of religious people that think that whether God exists or not is more or less just a personal preference. Sort of like whether you like chocolate or vanilla ice cream. And so he was delighted to discover a religious leader who thought, look, it's either true or false that there's a God. It's a matter of fact. And so if a person believes there's a God and there's not, then he's believing something false. Or if a person believes there's no God and there is, he's believing something false. So Dawkins seemingly is celebrating this. But then look at the second quote. The first one, by the way, is from The Blind Watchmaker, which dates probably in the 1980s. The presence or absence of a creative superintelligence is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it is not in practice or not yet a decided one. Now go one more frame, Frank, and look at the contrast here. In the first quote, he talks about something being a fact. In the second one, he talks about something being a scientific question. And I would submit to you that subtle shift betrays a worldview and a view of knowledge that understandably Christians should take exception to. Because I think we would argue, well, look, I agree with you that whether God exists or not is a factual question. But it's not necessarily a scientific question, which is to say, the truth or falsity of the statement God exists is not something that is demonstrable by the tools and methods of the natural sciences. It's not like you do an experiment, a Bunsen burner, and if it turns red, then God exists, and if it turns blue, then Allah exists, or something like that. So he's implying some kind of, what I think most of us would say, some kind of specious method to discover the truth by being this scientist. All right, one more quote, just to give you another example here before I tether this back to my previous statement. John Shook is a philosopher. I had the opportunity of debating him recently. He says, philosophical naturalism undertakes the responsibility for elaborating a comprehensive and coherent worldview based on experience, reason, and science, and for defending science's exclusive right to explore and theorize about all of reality. Now go one more slide there. He says it's science's exclusive right to theorize about all of reality. Well, besides the fact that this is a self-refuting statement, because that statement right there is not a scientific statement, it's a philosophical statement. And by the way, what is worse is this is made by a philosopher. You could almost give Richard Dawkins a pass as a scientist. Maybe you don't expect him to be very philosophically, internally consistent. But I was dismayed to discover that John Shook, as a philosopher, would say, well, only science has insights into reality. Why'd you get your PhD in philosophy then? Why didn't you get it in science? I didn't understand. And besides, again, as I said, the statement itself is not a scientific statement, so it's self-refuting. But when you have people like a Richard Dawkins or a John Shook, and we could think of many other examples, as seemingly the consummate empiricists, then it's no wonder that perhaps Christians are leery about someone who may advance in empiricism as a viable theory of knowledge. I want to submit to you that such fear and perhaps even skepticism in some quarters of empiricism is really not warranted. I'm going to just take a few minutes together to see if I can defend empiricism. Now, before you nod off here, let me just tell you that not only am I an empiricist, but it doesn't follow from empiricism necessarily that you can't have knowledge of non-empirical reality, like God, logic, morality, these kind of things. That doesn't follow. In fact, in a more extended version of this, say perhaps in a classroom, we talk about this in class, I would tease out what the philosophers would call the distinction between classical empiricism, and pretty much anything sounds cool if you put the word classical. And, like classic rock music or classical music. The difference between classical empiricism and modern empiricism. If I decide to say anything about that here in a few moments, fine. But if not, what you can do is you can stream a class. Now, you wouldn't want to do that. Then you would know the joke. I wouldn't be able to pull the joke on you. But we, as a number of other seminaries do, offer courses in philosophy that helps you understand what's sort of the ins and outs of some of these things like empiricism and what have people thought about this. So if I don't get another chance to tease that out here because of the constraints of time, I'll invite you to sign up for my classical philosophy course that I teach at the seminary. But let me start out defending empiricism as a biblical model of knowing. Clearly, the Bible is not a treatise on philosophy. But just as clearly, it seems to me, one can distill philosophical commitments that the Bible has. And I think this is clearly the case when it comes to human knowledge. Throughout the Bible, we can see that the characters of the Bible were aware of their physical surroundings by means of their natural faculties of knowing. At the same time, the Bible acknowledges the reality of non-sensory beings, such as angels, demons, the soul, and God. Nevertheless, it also acknowledges the reality of the sensible realm and our ability to know that realm truthfully. This is what I want to kind of focus on here, or at least emphasize. For example, I'll just give you a few examples from the Old Testament and the New Testament. For example, the story of Isaac's blessing in Genesis 27. Isaac going to Jacob instead of Esau hinged on the deception that Jacob was able to perpetrate because of Isaac's poor eyesight. Isaac was mistaken about the truth of the matter precisely because his eyes were compromised. So Genesis says this in chapter 27, verse 1. Now it came about when Isaac was old and his eyes were too dim to see, that he called his elder son Esau to him and said, "My son." And he said to him, "Here I am." And then it goes on to give the story that you're familiar with. So it seems to me the implication of this story, I take that back. It's not really the point of the story, but it seems to be a sort of a pervasive assumption and a presupposition almost, if you will, is that Isaac's ability to know the truth about his physical surroundings was compromised by his poor eyesight. Which means then that normal seeing is a legitimate way to know sensible reality. I think that follows by implication. Because he's deceived when his eyes are compromised, then the inverse of that is you know truth when your eyes are not compromised. Deuteronomy chapter 29. You have the story of God performing all sorts of wonders before the nation Israel. And God appealed to those wonders that were knowable by their senses. They saw these events happen. God appeals to those as proof that He had indeed worked these wonders. And of course, you could come up with numerous other examples, all making the same point, that there seems to be a tacit acknowledgement in the Old Testament that our faculties of seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling are by and large the means by which we know truth about sensible reality, if not anything else. But I think it is some more than that. New Testament gives us even more examples, and they hit closer to home to where we are as Christians, perhaps, especially as apologists. And I'll just run through these for the sake of time. I won't unpack them all. But you have Luke beginning his gospel, a treatise grounded in historical research based on eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony. In Acts chapter 10, you have Paul witnessing the life and death of Jesus and saying, you know these things. These didn't happen in a corner. You know, that's the thing he gave to King Agrippa and Festus in Acts 26. 1 John 1, that which we have seen and heard and beheld and handled. And he says, seen more than once and heard more than once. We declare unto you. Such a conspicuous signing on of empiricism, generally considered. A number of people heard and saw and touched the risen Jesus. Mary Magdalene, Mary and other women, Peter, the 2 disciples on the way to Emmaus, the 10 disciples, the 11 disciples, the 500 brethren, James and Paul. And it's precisely because Jesus presented himself alive physically that he testifies to the truthfulness of the resurrection. So it seems clearly to me that the empirical method played an indispensable role in the apologetic task of the early believers. Now I want to hasten to add, we talked about this a little bit in my workshop yesterday, that even the most friendly empiricists, friendly to us as Christians, that not the Dawkins and the Shooks of the world, but even the most friendly empiricists within our camp as Christians, would admit that our sensory faculties are not infallible, that they can be deceived. But of course you couldn't know that your sensory faculties were ever deceived unless you knew what the truth was in a given circumstance in order to know that what you thought it was isn't the truth. Right? You can't know you're deceived unless you knew what the truth was to know, well, what I thought it was a tree and it turned out to be a person standing in the shadows. We only know that it wasn't a tree because you were able to know that it was a person. So at some point your senses have to deliver the truth in order for you to make the judgment that even your senses sometimes are deceived. And of course we don't think we're omniscient because of our faculties. There's a limit to what we can know as finite beings. And I think we would own up to the fact that sometimes our senses can be scandalized by our moral fallenness. So a man can talk himself into committing adultery with his secretary, and it seems reasonable to him because of all what he sees in the circumstance. My wife doesn't really understand me and this kind of stuff. And in his mind, he thinks he's doing something, at least at the outset, like, well, I think I'm justified. And I think we would just look at that and go, no, it's just your fallenness, your sin has scandalized your ability to see and reason about this circumstance. All right, so I'm not suggesting that somehow, as an empiricist, these things lead us to all truth that can be had. We're not God. That it's never fails us. Sometimes it does. Or that sometimes I don't have a vested interest in rebelling against whatever my senses deliver to me. But you hear a number of concerns. I've alluded to some of those already that people have about empiricism. Empiricism can't give you logic. Empiricism can't give you morality. Empiricism can't give you the things of God. Empiricists can't justify induction. It shows that deduction is nothing but a circular argument. Those of you who've studied history of philosophy would probably recognize some of these objections from people like John Stuart Mill, for example, in his denigration of the syllogism. If that means something to you, then you need therapy, basically. You can get a shot for that. I'm starting to like this stuff. Okay, I'm better now. It shows that it's just another way of saying, in some people's mind, It's just another way of saying that only science gives us the truth, like John Shook said. That's the concerns that people have about empiricism. Now, as I also said earlier, just to repeat this so that I can get this plug in, the answer to those objections to empiricism, and they're important objections, but the answer to those is this distinction between classical and modern empiricism. And so, if you don't already know this, from Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas, this trajectory, especially as the Christian faith gets into the mix, these people, most of them, if not, well, most of them, I think, were empiricists. So all I'm suggesting to you without argument, I'm not giving you my argument here, I'm just throwing this out for you to consider, and then you can do your own research. The sort of empiricism characterized by the Richard Dawkins, what philosophers call scientism, the idea that only science can give you truth, that kind of empiricism is a very modern development in Western thought. It's not the history of empiricism. So I guess what my concern is I don't want you to be bullied into thinking that there's something wrong with this method, because I think there's something that you've got to cling to about the empiricism. I've already tried to argue that it seems to be biblical in some respects, but let me tie that together by outlining what I see a number of attacks that are coming against empiricism. If I'm alleging that God has created us in such a way that we come to know sensible world through the faculties that He's given us, and then I would go on to show, and we do this in the philosophy course, well, how can seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, how can that give me the laws of logic or principles of morality or God, the things of God? How can it do that? That's something we don't have time to go into here, and you're all thankful about that, I'm sure. But if that's the case, we know God exists by His creation. Romans 1 says the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen through the things that are made, so that we are without excuse. Psalm 19 says the heavens declare the handiwork of God. We know that God has invaded history physically by incarnating in Jesus Christ and then giving many infallible proofs and appearing to many. We know all this as apologists. If that's the case, then it shouldn't be surprising to us that from a number of different quarters, this method of knowing is being attacked. Empiricism is being attacked, I think, in some instances, as a means of trying to disabuse Christians and apologists of one of the most powerful tools in our arsenal of defending the faith, which is the evidence that we marshal as empiricists. So here would be the time where we would do a reconnaissance of the history of philosophy, which we're not going to do. I'll just gesture at a few things. Plato, for example, was an early Greek philosopher. Not the Play-Doh. Although Plato, if he stayed out overnight out of his can, he did get really hard and stiff and rigor mortis. That's where they get that. No, that's not true. I just made that up. Plato, he didn't liken whatever transcendent world he thought existed. He didn't liken that to God, as Christians do. We say that there's a transcendent existent being that's God. In fact, just as an aside, it's a very interesting in the history of philosophy that in the ancient Greek philosophy, the ancient Greeks never connected their ultimate principles in their philosophy, or if you want to say in their metaphysics, with their ultimate principles in their religion. Christianity's influence in Western thought was, it said, this is the same being. Ultimate being, metaphysically, is God, the object of worship. It's the same being. That was an innovation that Christians brought as it mixed with Greek thought. But Plato was one of these types that would say, look, you know, the real reality is this sort of transcendent realm, and the sensible world is just at best like shadows. So he was summarily uninterested in the machinations of the physical world. It didn't turn him on. He was into these sort of ethereal kind of things. And so Platonism has exerted a tremendous influence in Western thought. There's a whole trajectory of Platonism you can follow. that sort of is characterized by this relatively disinterest in the physical realm. I mean, it's some of its worst manifestations would be things like Christian asceticism, where Christians think being spiritual is depriving yourself of as much physical things as you can and still not die. So you dress real prosaic and you just eat gruel all day long, and you just sit around and you go, that's not the Christian line. You know, sure, we can overdo things and we can get overly preoccupied with this world, but this world is part of the real. So it's okay to eat and laugh and to recreate on occasions, as long as it's done within the boundaries and according to the dictates that God has revealed to us through His Word. Then it's something to celebrate. When I was a youth worker in my church, and I wasn't on staff at the church, I was just working with the young people in Dallas, Texas. And we would take the high school kids and sometimes the college kids skiing in Colorado every year. That was the place to go. When I lived in Dallas, you go to downhill ski in Colorado. And I asked one of the fellow youth workers, I said, because we were all talking about, we were being real pious, like, we just want to glorify God in everything you do, and all that you say or do, do all for the glory of God. I asked one of them, I said, how does downhill skiing glorify God? And I was being serious. I wanted them to think, okay, well, we say we want to glorify God, but how does doing this glorify God? Well, there's a lot of things I think we could say about that, but I think one of them is the very fact that you could celebrate the beauty of God's creation and causes you to acknowledge Him as the infinitely beautiful Creator. That can happen to you when you're above the tree line on a snowy slope. It can happen to you at a local lake. I understand that, but I'm saying that's what can happen. You can celebrate the God of creation by enjoying His creation. You can celebrate love and friendship and laughter and stuff with other Christians as you're recreating together and just enjoying what God has made. So, I think sometimes this Platonic kind of mindset, the real you is just your soul idea, that's not biblical. The real you is a soul and body together, physical and non-physical. Descartes was another philosopher who exerted a deleterious impact on subsequent thought. I don't mean to insult all the Cartesians here. I just wanted to say the word Cartesian because it just sounds cool. My theory is, my PhD's in philosophy, but nobody's going to be talking about what I think 2,000 years from now, like we're doing Plato and Aristotle. Because my theory is, to really make it in philosophy, your name has to sound like a real cool adjective. So, Platonic. That's just cool. Aristotelian, Cartesian, Howean. I'm doomed out of the chute. There's no way anybody's going to be talking about, I'm a Howean. I think you can get shots for that, okay? But Descartes' influence is both good and bad, because it was through, I think, the influence of Descartes and his disciples that the natural sciences were able to discover how incredibly powerful the tools of mathematics were in unlocking our understanding of physical reality. So mathematics has really been an integral part in the advancements of what we call the natural sciences. In fact, all of your scientific paradigm shifts, from Ptolemy to Copernicus, the qualifications in celestial mechanics of Newton, from Newton to Einstein, from Einstein to Bohr, and quantum physics, all of those shifts were largely spearheaded by the mathematicians. Galileo wasn't even accepted as right in his heliocentrism until several centuries later when the mathematics. So I celebrate that, and I'm glad that Descartes did that. The problem is, when you look at the mathematics of a thing, pretty much anything that exists has something mathematical about it, even God. How many gods are there? One. So that's mathematical. It's a number. So everything has something mathematical about it. Problem is, if that's the main or only tool in your toolbox. You know, the old adage that if your only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then pretty soon everything starts to look like a nail to you. So what the influence of Descartes did is it began to just constrain humans to think that really the math is the key to everything. Well, no, math is just part of everything. It's not the whole thing. So sure, I can get you a spreadsheet and show you the allotments of time that my wife and I have when we do a lot of international travel, and then we go see family and, you know, and go out to eat, these kind of things. And so I could show you so we spend 72% of our time, doing this, and 20%, and I could get it all, and it'd all be mathematical. But that's not going to say anything about our relationship as husband and wife, is it? Why? Because that dimension is not quantifiable. It's qualifiable. Well, I would submit to you there's a lot of aspects of real things, even physical things. There are lots of dimensions to that thing. Math being one, but not the only one. And by the way, philosophy by and large is the discipline that tries to understand how these aspects of a thing, its essence and its attributes and its characteristics and its function and its these kind of things. It's philosophy that sort of deals with that. That's what gave me one of my interests in philosophy. But if math becomes dominant, then I think it begins to skew what we think about the nature of things. So we're having a pro-life, pro-abortion debate in this country for decades. One of the problems, in my opinion, is that pro-abortion people, by and large, at least the ones I'm familiar with, they don't think in terms of human nature. You and I, as Christians, would say a human has a nature, what the theologian calls a soul. It has an essence. That's why we say from the moment it comes into existence at conception, it is a human. But since they don't traffic in natures, then how do they describe and understand a human? They do it functionally. That's why you hear phrases like, well, it doesn't have a brain wave, or it doesn't have a sense of self-awareness, or it doesn't have a social kind of dimension. These are all functions. Those aren't essences. I can be a human without having the function of a human. That's what a child in the womb. It's not going to have a sense of humor, probably. It's not going to have a moral self-awareness. But we don't define it functionally. We define it essentially. Well, that's a philosophical thing. But where did this functional notion come from? I think it's sort of residual from quantifying stuff. Because you can quantify functions. You can put them on spreadsheets and subject them to algorithms and make predictions. Hey, I love the fact that science gives us air conditioning. I love the fact that science gives us Malarone. When my wife and I traveled to malaria areas of South America where she grew up. So I celebrate what science does for me. I just regret that at the same time, this Cartesian influence has created, I think, in some respects, the Dawkins or the Shooks of the world. Another attack on empiricism is postmodernism. You've heard that word thrown around a lot. Postmodernism basically just is after the modernism. Well, what's modernism? Modernism is the Dawkins and Shooks. Postmodernism is beyond that. Postmodernism began to think, look, there's more to life than just the sciences can give us. Problem is, they didn't go back to our roots in Western civilization, to the truths of God and the Bible. They've gone a step further away into moral and epistemological relativism. Now, I heard a startling story. These two women were in my office. One of them was a graduate from our seminary, and she's poised to enter our PhD program, which, by the way, we offer PhD, and I direct the PhD program. Any takers, you can talk to me afterwards. Her colleague, and she and this other woman were both teachers at a local Christian high school. And so they came into my office to talk to me about this phenomenon that they noticed. They said, our high school kids, man, when they go out, they are loaded for bear. Man, we teach them about Darwinism, and we show them the problems with evolution. We're pumping in the intelligent design, apologetics, and these kind of things, and fine-tuning and all. And they're ready to defend, moral objectivism or moral absolutism. And so they're loaded and ready to go and fight the apologetic battles at the college level. And they said, we're discovering, where their students are getting most stumbled in their faith? In the English department. English department? Why? So what? Because they're going into the English department and they're being disabused of any commonsensical notion of how to understand written text. The English professors are saying there is no meaning in the text. The meaning is what you bring to the text. It's your own milieu and worldview and your own rose-colored glasses, and that's what you do. And so when you read a text, this is what it means to you. And so the kids sit around, they're reading the poems. And we even do this in Bible study. What does this verse mean to you? Well, what is that influence from? That's postmodernism. That's really where it's rearing its head, is in the literature and in English departments. This sort of relativism. So that was a rude awakening for me. I was expecting, the scientists, the Dawkins, boy, they're just being talked out of their belief in the Creator because it was scary to think. Now, postmodernism isn't everywhere, but I've come to believe it is somewhere. You have more antique, ancient attacks on empiricism. Let me just touch on two more real quickly as we close up. In some strands of the Hindu tradition, the teaching there is that the sensible world is Maya. It's sort of like a dream. It's like an illusion. So the more you engage the physical world, the more distracted you are from the spirit realm. And so you need to sort of learn how to detach from your physical surroundings. Now, let me just remind you why this bothers me. Because Jesus and God, through Jesus and through His apostles and prophets, have declared His truths via these physical realities. Many infallible proofs. We saw the prints in his hands. We handled Him. We talked to Him. He ate breakfast after He was raised. Do you see how the truths of God are so tethered to Him revealing Himself through the physical world that it's not surprising you're going to have world religions that go, physical world keeps you away from this. What's really important, which is the spirit realm. That's what you need to do. I go, somebody's trying to talk me out of paying attention to the physical world. Why would they want to do that? Well, Satan would want to do that because he knows, as C.S. Lewis talks about in the Screwtape Letters, the more you direct people to the thinking about their reality, their physical reality, the more you think cogently about that, the more it's going to point to the Creator. And that's what you don't want. And as a subset of Hinduism, at least some of the strands in Hinduism, you have a lot going on in the occult. Probably the area that I've spent more time in research in, besides my formal studies in philosophy, has just been the occult. So I have all these creepy books in my library and stuff. In fact, one time I was doing a talk on Christian perspective on the occult. I was with a bunch of young adults, and we're all sitting around somebody's living room, in a circle, and we're talking. I had my show and tell, and I'm doing all this stuff. And then there was a Q&A, and this lady was right here, and she goes, well, and nobody knew me except the guy that invited me to come. She goes, well, how do you read all that stuff and it not affect you? It does affect me! And I just leapt out. I leapt for her throat. Everybody came about that far off their chairs. It was hilarious. It does affect me! And you're beginning to maybe agree with her, perhaps. I don't know. But you have things like the New Thought movement, Mary Baker Eddy, Christian Science, New Age movement, that have such a disdain for this physical realm. And I think it's not a coincidence that Satan would attack empiricism. You even have it in popular media. One of my favorite movie series of all is Star Wars. But right at the very beginning in A New Hope, when Luke is practicing the use of his lightsaber against the little remote, the little ball that shoots these little stingers out, and he's trying to do that. Obi-Wan goes over to him and puts the blast helmet on and pulls the blast shield down, which just looks like solid metal, and pulls it down in front of his eyes. And Luke says, well, with the blast shield down, I can't see anything. And Obi-Wan says, your eyes can deceive you. Don't trust them. You need to stretch out with your feelings. And I just said, hey, listen, I do a whole presentation on Star Wars, which I love the movies, so I'm not saying Christians shouldn't watch this stuff. That's not my point. But you would be surprised to know what George Lucas has to say about what he was trying to say in these movies. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised as apologists. But I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear what George Lucas says, this is what I'm trying to say. And I'm telling you, it's not Christian. It's anti-Christian. So the upshot then, God has created us as humans to be able to know the physical world through our senses. It's no wonder then that the enemy would not want us to trust our senses. Since it's by them that we see that the heavens declare the handiwork of God, Psalm 19. It's by them that the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen by the things that are made, Romans chapter 1. And it is by them that the Christian is able, quote, to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Thank you.